This content is brought to you by Uphold, which makes crypto investing easy. I've been a user of Uphold since 2017. They're one of my go-to exchanges. You can buy, sell, and trade cryptocurrencies on Uphold. You can also trade precious metals and equities. They have 10 plus million users, 250 plus cryptocurrencies, and they're available in 150 countries. As with all exchanges, you can buy and sell on them, but I highly recommend you custody your own crypto, not your keys, not your coins. If you'd like to learn more about Uphold, please visit the link in the description. Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is Sheila Warren, who's the CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation. Sheila, it's great to have you back on.
Oh, thanks, Tony. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I can't believe it's been a year since we last spoke. And it's funny, it was March 2022, I think 2 days from now. So I don't know if that's serendipitous or what's going on, but
Well, it is like flip, reverse, night and day from when we last chatted, when things were kind of up and up and up and up. And now we're in the situation where I feel like the very existence of crypto in the United States is kind of in question. So, what can I say?
It's crazy times. It's crazy times in crypto, but as well as the traditional financial markets with the banks. Let's start with Operation Choke Point 2.0, because we're seeing a coordinated effort by multiple government agencies against crypto, enforcement actions, roadblocks, and then we'll talk a bit about the banking and how that fits in. But what are you hearing about Operation Choke Point 2.0?
Yeah, well, we're not really leaning into that choke point language, which is very, very political language. But I think what we are investigating and looking into is there some kind of systematic attempt by the federal government and various agencies to unbank or debank or sufficiently de-risk crypto companies such that they are basically forced to offshore? And what I can tell you is that the evidence is not of a conspiracy. I think people love conspiracy theories, and that's always great. There's no question there are certain actors who are, quite influential within the Biden administration and the federal government who are not giant fans of crypto. I think we have to acknowledge that the events of 2022 did not help us there. Okay, so some people who were kind of neutral on this or maybe open to the potential are now kind of almost taking Pascal's wager on it. And they're saying, well, do I really want to be the person that's supporting this thing that has had evidence that it's not great? But I think that this is a general, my view on this from having talked to people all over Washington and in other countries, is that this really is about a broader questioning around tech in general. And around some folks' belief, and this is kind of well documented, right? Whether it's big tech or whether it's VC or whatever it is, but are we kind of leaning too much into tech, and has that actually been detrimental to our society and not productive? And so views on that are going to differ, but I do think that crypto is kind of catching the wave, if you will, of a kind of techlash, what people have called it, which long predates any sort of specific activity that is applying to crypto companies.
That's so interesting, because tech has been a big part of our economy and growth of jobs and the economic benefits. I mean, and just amazing innovation with the Googles of the world and so forth, and Elon and what he's doing. So it's just so fascinating that this is rearing its head all of a sudden. Why do you think that is? And this is maybe a very hard question to answer.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. It's kind of the question, isn't it? I do think that some of this is about perceived or actual abuse. I think it's about data capture and data hacks. I think it's about the release of private information that people didn't understand, was being released to other parties. So it goes back to a lot of the kind of issues that plagued Facebook specifically, right? But also, I think to some extent, even Amazon and Google and other companies that have created monetization out of capture. And I think the irony, of course, as you well know, and those listening to this show know, is that Web3 is designed to address exactly that, right? But for folks who haven't necessarily taken the time or been offered the education to understand what crypto and what the blockchain can actually enable, they kind of see it as the next stage of the previous thing, right? Which they don't love. And so again, I think you saw a lot of this around Libra, right? I mean, the reason that Libra got the attention it got was because it was arguably overly identified with Facebook, overly or not, right? Regardless, that was the kind of equation that was done. And there's no love lost for some of those kinds of approaches to things. So, I think that some of this we have to acknowledge is legitimate. Some of these problems very much exist. That's why a lot of us are so committed to Web3 and to crypto. But some of this stuff is just kind of building on things that really didn't have a lot to do with us. And therefore, it makes it very challenging to unwind these perceptions because they aren't really about crypto at all. And I think that is very true in the case of these banking industry, the situation that we've been dealing with the last couple of weeks, which really isn't about crypto. It's about banking industry weakness, right? It's about traditional classic bank runs. And so some of that blame is getting placed on, funders or investors who perceive to have caused the bank run through their actions, et cetera. But none of that, again, has really anything specifically to do with crypto.
Yeah, to your point, there's like many layers to this onion to peel away here, because even I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, because there were rumblings about Elizabeth Warren and some of these other folks that were targeting the Silvergates, the SVBs and all that. But it caused a domino effect, and it revealed how bad the finances and the balance sheet is for these banks with interest rate hikes and the bonds and so forth. So it's almost like it started with, I don't know if you want to say rumblings about crypto, but then it went into, the banks are collapsing.
Well, here's the irony, okay? I mean, why was there concentration? And so first of all, I would push back. SVB had no concentration in crypto. We all know that, but it's just worth saying for those who may not have been following this as closely. Silicon Valley Bank had no concentration in crypto, some concentration in tech, but honestly, it was a regional bank. Like I have friends who have nonprofits, churches, all kinds of different kinds of organizations who were banked at SVB. It's a very well-known bank. A lot of folks use it as their local bank out here in Silicon Valley. So the idea that it was a crypto bank is just ludicrous. And I don't think anyone's actually saying that, right? I would actually say the same thing is true of Signature. There's a ton of real estate, that was banked through Signature. There are a lot of other things going on there. Now, Silvergate was highly exposed to crypto. It was kind of the three, I think it was the most arguably concentrated in crypto. But you have to ask yourself, why is it that Silvergate and Signature and even SVB to some extent, or some of these banks had such a high concentration in crypto? And the reason is because crypto companies had a hard time getting banked in other places. So there's this there's a classification of banks called SIFIs or GSIBs. They're basically globally sustainably important banks. So they're the banks that are just like the too big to fail kind of banks, right? A lot of those were not banking crypto companies. And that is a challenge. And so crypto companies were banking again with smaller players, regional players, other kinds of banking options. And again, we're talking about doing basic corporate accounting. We're not talking about banking a crypto asset itself. We're talking about payroll, right? Like having money to pay your lease or your whatever it is, right? Like just basic business activities. And they were forced to kind of go to some of these places. And so, of course, you had an over engagement, right, to some extent, or we call that concentration in the banking sector, a concentration of some of those companies in places that were willing to bank them. Because as one person got banked there, someone else was like, oh, hey, they're, really open to this, what have you. And so that I think is a failure of the banking system and of the way that banks think about risk. And so my argument has really been throughout all of this that we're having the wrong conversation about risk. Because rather than focusing on concentration of risk, which is what led to this whole situation, we're focusing on some perceived risk of a particular industry. And the irony is that if you really think crypto is super highly risky, which I mean, that's a fair argument. You could that's an opinion, right? Right. You'd want it spread out across as many banks as possible, not put into a handful of banks, right? You'd want the exact opposite approach to what was kind of either passively or actively encouraged by some bank supervisors and by others in the ecosystem, or even just through banks themselves deeming this particular activity threatening to their own business models, right? Which is a fact I think we can't ignore either.
So where do crypto companies go from here? It sounds like it's tough out there, with many of them not being able to get banking access. I've heard, and I haven't confirmed, but like bank accounts are getting closed by different banks and so forth. Yet you have these bigger banks like the JP Morgans. They haven't closed anything or cut off anything from the companies they support, like maybe your Coinbase, Gemini, and so forth. So where do we go from here? And are some of these companies going to be forced to move overseas?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to note that, to your point, I mean, it's unconfirmed. And so we've been doing a lot of, asking through a variety of private places and public places and other colleagues of ours. We're just trying to get stories on the record, frankly, about people that have actually been debanked. And thus far, we're not really hearing that story. We're hearing that it's very challenging. It's been extremely inconvenient. It's been extremely stressful to get new accounts, but it has been successful thus far for the vast majority of companies. And I will say the stress there was different from some of the stress of other, again, I have like a ton of, people that I know in Silicon Valley who work in other like life sciences or healthcare or, or drones or, whatever it is, some other kind of tech company context. They also had very challenging times getting bank accounts given the timing and how all this went down, right? Because there was just this run and everyone was trying to do the same thing at the same time. But crypto did have a harder time. I think it's fair to say that crypto had a harder time, but people did get banked. And so that would kind of give the counterpoint, which is to say, there are a bunch of banks who were like, hey, we'd love to diversify. Maybe they're over concentrated in something else. And they're like, this is a chance for us to take in some of these tech startups and crypto companies and actually diversify our holdings in a different way, which is interesting, So that is, I think, the story that's not really getting told. Now, all that being said, the facts on the ground about, conversion of accounts and all that being said, and at some point this will have settled and we'll really be able to get some numbers around what happened here and where everyone wound up, because it is certainly possible everyone's going to a new 3 banks or whatever, right? And we're just going to move the concentration risk to a different place. That is certainly possible. No evidence of that either at the moment. But I do think that a lot of people who are founders or others in crypto are kind of like, well, what's the point of any of this? Am I just kind of like chasing my tail here? At some point, given that we've got other jurisdictions that are so friendly to crypto. I mean, we've got a team right now in the UK and in Brussels that are just meeting with, all kinds of folks, bank supervisors and regulators and HMT and Prime Minister's office, members of parliament. And they're just like, yeah, we don't know what crypto is going to become, but it's an innovation we think is really important. We don't want to see it leave our boundaries, right? And so we welcome it. And so that the opposite approach is happening at other places. And so I think there are some folks who are questioning, is this worth the hassle? Mm-hmm. Is it worth building in quicksand here? We don't know what's going to come down. There's not even a framework. So the way I've been kind of analogizing this is in other countries, there's a plane in flight, right? And the flight path. You don't know exactly where it's going to land, but you're like, that plane is going to France. And it might wind up in Paris or Nice or Marseille, but pretty sure, maybe the Alps, pretty sure it's going to be in France. In the United States, you're like, okay, is there a plane in flight? And if so, is it going to, I don't know, Alaska or Hawaii? Or like, you have no idea. We don't have any sense of where this is going to wind up. And there's no indication the US can even land the plane. So I think a lot of people are understandably frustrated by this and are starting to question whether, this is the right move for them and their employees who just ultimately want stability.
Yeah, for sure. And I know you probably can't talk about everything, but what is the Crypto Council for Innovation currently, or what activities are you involved in the US? Are you working with members of Congress and to try to, get something going?
All of the above. So we're working on the Hill, we're working with the White House, working with the agencies, the regulators, the banks, working with other fellow associations, both in fintech and in tech in general, and of course in crypto. And we're working across think tanks as well to just kind of say, look, there are some significant issues if crypto goes offshore, more than just challenge to companies, a loss of innovation and loss of jobs, which are I would like to think those are significant enough, but to some folks, they aren't. There are national security implications. So I did a tweet thread that went viral a couple of weeks ago about semiconductors. And I basically was saying it is absolutely wild to me to watch crypto, whether deliberately by some people or inadvertently by others, getting offshored, right? Or like that movement happening at the same time as we are desperately trying to get back semiconductor manufacturing. Like, it's just wild to me because ultimately the national security implications are likely similar, right? And nobody thought when we offshored semiconductor chips manufacturing that like 40 years later, that was going to be like the linchpin to kind of like our ability to function as an economy. Like no one was thinking like that, right? And we don't know. Again, nobody knows. I don't care who you are, Balaji, whoever, nobody knows what's going to happen in crypto. But what we can probably predict is that it's going to be a critical part of our global digital economy. And we know that because other countries are leaning into it as the US is leaning out. So our options are keep it here, try to put some parameters around it that make sense for our economy, have a piece of that, or watch it go away. And then, 10 years from now, or however many years from now, desperately try to get it back through mechanisms and incentives that may not even be possible or viable. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing. And so that is an activity that's just, it's universal in our minds. So we're working with all kinds of different sectors. We're working with all kinds of different sectors to help make that case.
Do you feel that this pushback that we're seeing, yes, some of it is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to what happened last year, Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX and so forth, but also that we're in a bear market and some of these incumbents are maybe fighting, right? We know how DC works, lobbying and so forth. And this is, hey, we want to slow this down. It's going too fast. It's disrupting a lot here. Do you think there's a layer to it?
I do think that we underestimate that. I mean, I don't see fractional reserve banking going away. I don't think that's realistic. Certainly not in my lifetime, but I do think that crypto rails, that they pose a challenge to that model, right? The same way that kind of when money markets started, like there was this pushback against this model that's like, well, it doesn't give us the same leverage, doesn't give us the same ability to basically create yield. Like all those things are very real. And so, I don't think that I think banks are much more practical, to some extent than that. But I do think that there are some in sort of TradFi or whatnot that are kind of looking at this and saying, well, the chips are down for crypto. Maybe it's a time to kind of press an advantage and think about it that way. So I don't want to overstate that. Again, I don't see a conspiracy theory here, and I don't really have a lot of patience for conspiracy theories, but I do think we underestimate the self-interest of some traditional actors who are kind of like, well, if that thing really goes, what does it mean for my business? The good news, I think, there is that you've seen so many legacy institutions who are deeply engaged with this stuff, ironically, again, right? That are really have spent a lot of time and investment trying to learn about this. A lot of the payments companies have spent tremendous amounts of resources and time really trying to ready themselves for a digital asset future. And now they're feeling like that investment's proving to be like, they're annoyed, frankly, right? So it goes both ways. And I think the extent to which folks were kind of preparing themselves and readying for this new world is indicative of the extent to which they're maybe trying to push back on that now, which again, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but there's something there for sure.
Well, as you're saying that, I thought of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, two guys who have been very critical of Bitcoin.
They don't love us. They don't love crypto for sure. Yeah.
You mentioned Balaji. So I'm assuming you don't believe in the $1 million at 90.
I mean, I just think it's like, I don't, do I believe in it or not believe in it? I mean, I don't believe in it, but fine, we can land that point. But that kind of begs the question, right? I feel like I feel like we need to be having a really important conversation right now about risk. And so I don't think that that sort of conversation is really helping with the policy discussions we have to have right now. But, hey, it's a interesting statement, an interesting proposition. And, who knows? You never know. I've seen crazy. I would say now, I think we've all seen crazier things in crypto. So, here we are. But in my view, I think that it kind of leans into the part of the narrative that isn't really helping us in the crypto policy space. When what we really be talking about is, look, there are cracks and fractures in legacy systems, and crypto, with the right regulatory guardrails, can address some of those and help bolster and can be a critical part of a more highly functioning, more inclusive economy, or it can be none of those things, and those are kind of the choices that we're facing. So that's a conversation I prefer to have. And, anything else I find maybe entertaining on some level, but maybe not the most well-timed injection into the public conversation. I'll put it that way.
I think it's a great marketing campaign, but that's all.
Well, you said it.
All right. So there's two big lawsuits happening against the SEC, which a lot of people have eyes on, and that is Ripple and Grayscale. Let's talk Ripple first, because the Crypto Council for Innovation did file an amicus brief on behalf of Ripple. And we may hear from the judge anytime. It could happen today or, by early next month.
Yeah.
What do you, what's the latest, from your perspective on how you're seeing this play out and the impact on the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that this particular suit, as it was brought, is winnable by Ripple. I've always thought. I thought that since the very beginning. And I actually said that a long time ago and took a lot of heat on Twitter for it, by the way, which I still don't really understand. In my mind, any company that's resourced to take on this agency at this time, we should be supporting. So I don't really understand. I never really understood. It's been great to see how folks have kind of come around to that. But again, I was very confused by the initial reaction to it because it seemed to me that they were kind of trying to lay a precedent that could be very powerful and help a lot of other folks. So we were happy to file an amicus in that case. And it was a pretty straightforward thing to do because I'd been kind of following it with some interest for some time. I think the same thing is true of Grayscale, by the way. I think that Grayscale, has a case that I think is proving already with some of the statements that have been made. Certainly it has a lot of merit. And so the question is going to become like, a lot of this is about like what judge you pull and all kinds of other things, right? But I think that what is the critical thing, I guess I want to land is that this is not under this particular chair. This is not an agency that is looking to, like I say, put that plane in flight that I was talking about, right? And give us a destination. This is an agency under this chair. There are several other commissioners there who I think do not feel this way. We all know who they are. But under this chair, I think this is an agency that doesn't want to have a plane take flight. And is claiming that, the planes that have already landed, I'm really pushing this analogy way too far, but is claiming the planes that have already landed encompass all of our activity, which is just hot bananas. I mean, if that were the case, we would not be in a situation where all these enforcement, it just doesn't make any sense. So that doesn't work, right? I think one thing I do want to note though, Tony, because this is well-covered territory, that as you know, but I think one thing I want to land is that nobody else has this sort of jurisdictional turf war that we have in the United States. The SEC and CFTC in many other countries are one agency, right? Like they have oversight of the whole shebang. And so you don't have this kind of turf war playing out that I do think is a big part of this. And I think folks understood that after last year's activity around DCCPA and, with the CFTC and all of that. But that's just the reason that you're not seeing this complexity in other countries is because they don't have our complex regulatory system, right? It's easier. So I do think that this is, again, it's more political than a lot of people realize. And it's not just intractability of this chair, although I think we can all just own that that's what's going on here, is a very intractable chair who just sees it the way he sees it and is not open to other kinds of conversations. So a judge is going to have to eventually force an openness to a conversation that's playing out in court. And that's what we all saw coming for a few years now. But I do think that the politics around this should not go unstated because that is a big part of what's happening here as well.
Final question here for you. CBDCs, and there's talks and pilots and launches all over the world. Do you think we see the digital dollar this year, and what impact do you think that may have on the banking system and what we're trying to solve here and fix with this broken financial system?
Yeah. So I don't think we see it this year just because even if the direction becomes very clear that one will roll out, it takes longer than that to build one, right? So Christine Lagarde said last May in Davos, 4 years to a digital euro. And I thought that timeframe was ambitious, frankly. So certainly not this year, just because for practical reasons. Do I think we'll see a commitment to building one? I think is an interesting question. I don't know. I have always been of the view, I am highly, highly skeptical of a retail CBDC versus a stablecoin. In my mind, the idea that a retail CBDC is something that wouldn't just take on the same properties as kind of like the way banks work with the Fed right now. There's so many complex things to that. A wholesale CBDC is interesting. I'm watching with a lot of interest some of the pilots happening in other countries, the UAE and India, and a lot of those have been, they've been successful to the extent that what they're dealing with, right, which is kind of cross-border interbank settlements and real-time settlements and things like that. They do help with efficiency, and that's pretty well documented at this point. So could I see something like that and a signal for that? That makes a little more sense to me. But again, I think the reality around what a build would look like and take, even with some of the work that's been done, a lot of really smart work is done by a lot of smart people at various branches of the Fed. But I still think that you're going to see it's a longer conversation because it is not obvious to me what problems that's actually solving. I'm also highly skeptical that in the advent of FedNow, they're suddenly going to be like, and this other thing also. It's like, why wouldn't you kind of let that settle and see if it actually does what it does and what it doesn't do before deciding to embark on a massive project at great cost? So it just doesn't seem to make sense to me. But like I say, I've been wrong before, and certainly I'm not the one making that decision, and I don't envy the folks making that decision. So I guess we'll have to see how it plays out.
For sure. Sheila, always great info. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, such a pleasure, Tony. Thanks for having me.